So please join me in welcoming Abbot John Klassen to give our keynote address, Taking Care of Mind, Heart, and Body, Sustaining and Nurturing a Catholic Benedictine Environment.
As these invitations go, and I'm sure you've, in various parts of your lives at various times, had similar ones, one agrees about a year in advance to give a presentation like this. And in a rapidly changing world, what seemed to be an important but approachable topic, even 6 months ago, all of a sudden is changed by the world we're in and by events that occur within the last 3 months, 2 months, So, Deepwater Horizon was an incredibly sophisticated drilling rig. It was built in 2001, owned by a company and leased to British Petroleum. Last fall, it drilled the deepest well in the history of any offshore rig, down to the vertical depth of 35,000 feet. About 7 miles into the core of the earth. On April 20th, at about 10 p.m. at night, an explosion on this rig left 11 people dead, or at least presumed dead. The resulting fire could not be put out, and on the 22nd of April, the rig actually sank, and in doing so, twisted and broke the pipe down at the very bottom of the ocean at a depth of about 5,000 feet. Okay? At this point, 12,000 to 19,000 barrels of oil, and note that each barrel of oil is about 50 to 55 gallons of oil. Okay, so we're talking a lot of oil. Per day has been spewing into the Gulf of Mexico. The worst estimate is that it's at 39 million gallons, and the most conservative estimate is 18 million gallons. By comparison, the 1989 spill of the Exxon Valdez was 11 million gallons. Because the oil to speak about this as a spill is a misnomer. Because it presumes that you're dumping it in from the top, and it will most likely more or less stay on the top. But because it's shooting up from the bottom, what's happening is that you're getting a gradient of densities. And a lot of the more dense oil is in fact staying and diffusing through the water of the Gulf. What that means is that none of our engineers and none of the people who have attended to spills in the past, most of the stuff that they know about this is in fact rendered useless. We in fact are having to learn what to do with this spill. Please note that I am not blaming British Petroleum. I don't know enough to assign blame in this case, nor am I blaming the government. But I am saying that it would have been, would have felt foolish indeed to not mention this incredible threat to the Gulf of Mexico on a conference that's devoted to the topic of sustainability, because it is precisely our demand for oil that creates our desire and need to push this kind of technology forward, and that actually creates the conditions for an accident. I realize that we cannot fix this situation, but the accident itself highlights the importance of this conversation and our willingness to act on behalf of all of our campuses to explore the topic of sustainability in its multifaceted presence on our campus. A parable. I want to begin with a parable from Philip Slater's book, The Pursuit of Loneliness, written in the 1970s. And even though the book is dated in some ways, Slater has put his finger on at least some of the dilemmas of the American character and situation. And this is the way that parable goes. Once upon a time, there was a man who sought escape from the prattle of his neighbors. and went to live alone in a hut that he had found in the forest. At first he was content, but a bitter winter led him to cut down the trees around the hut for firewood. The next summer he was hot and uncomfortable because his hut no longer had any shade, and he complained bitterly about the harshness of the elements. He made a little garden and kept some chickens, but rabbits were attracted by the garden, the food, and they ate much of it. I think you have an experience of that. At least one of the monks does around here. Okay? The man went into the forest and he trapped a fox, which he tamed and taught to catch the rabbits. But the fox went and ate up the chickens as well. And the man shot the fox and cursed the perfidy of the creatures of the wild. The man always threw his refuse on the floor of his hut, and soon it swarmed with vermin. He then built an ingenious system of hooks and pulleys, and so that everything in the hut could be lifted off the floor. But the strain was much too much for this old building, and the whole thing collapsed. The man grumbled about the inferior construction of the hut, and he built himself a new one. One day he boasted to a relative of just how wonderful this place was, about the peaceful beauty and the plentiful game that were present around this forest home. The relative was impressed and told his neighbors, and soon they began to use the area for picnics and hunting excursions. The man was upset by this and cursed the intrusiveness of human beings. He began posting signs, setting traps, and shooting at those who came near his dwelling. In revenge, groups of boys would come in the night and try to frighten him, and sometimes they would just do the kind of mischief that boys do and steal things. And the man took to sleeping every night with a shotgun across his knees. And one night he turned in his sleep and he shot off his foot. The villagers were saddened by his misfortune, and thereafter they stayed away from his part of the forest. The man became lonely, and he cursed the unfriendliness of his former neighbors. And all of these troubles the man saw as coming from outside of himself, for which reason, and because of his technical skill, the villagers called him the American. I think it's worthwhile to unpack this parable, because even though it was written some time ago, it still, contains at least some pointers to the dilemma of the larger culture that we're in. We are not here all by ourselves as Benedictine institutions. Some elements. The dream of finding the perfect life somehow away from the community. The dream, and we see it all the time in car commercials ad infinitum, of somehow being on the freeway of life in this wonderful, sexy, high-powered car, and we're the only ones on that freeway. Mercy. Of not seeing how all my actions and everything that I do, but everything that we do as a community, is connected to everything else, and seeing what the consequences are going to be down the line. Of using resources without regard for the future. And finally, throwing all the garbage on the floor without a thought for that particular set of consequences. And we could spin this out even further. But it's really hard for us sometimes as a culture and a society to attend to these kinds of fundamental elements of what it means to live on this earth. Some comments on the use of the word sustainability. Sustainability has become a heavily used word, and our culture as a whole is extremely adept at taking good language, sucking the life out of it, and then discarding it. So, does the word sustainability have enough resilience, enough complexity, enough, if you will, density as a word, to guide our questioning, to guide what we think about as individuals and as communities and as a society. And I want to answer yes to that set of questions. I think sustainability is an awfully, awfully good word. It allows for us to pose questions about myself as an individual, how sustainable my life is, for example, as a leader, as Abbot or as president or as a faculty member. We constantly have to pose questions about, and the way I'm doing this work, can I do it over the long haul? If I'm teaching an organic chemistry class, the way that I'm organizing that class and the labs and everything that's in it, is it truly sustainable over the long haul? I mean, so I can go that way, but I can also go the other way in terms of how are we doing as an institution vis-a-vis the overall sustainability. So I think the word sustainability has enough complexity in it to allow us to move where we stand and to look and to address a whole field of questions. I don't think that there are any quick technical fixes to the fundamental question of environmental sustainability for our country and our world. Almost every part of our complex and interrelated world needs to change. Our sense of the human place in the rest of creation and its spiritual meaning for us. Manufacturing processes and the amount of stuff we make and sell. The amount and kind of waste that we generate each day. The kind of food that we eat and where and how it is produced. Our understanding of how to assign costs to what we use to live. The sustainability movement encompasses all these dimensions and more. I believe that the Word is able to help us think well about environmental questions and empower our learning and teaching culture to be transformed. What would happen if we would include the idea of sustainability as integral to our respective mission and vision statements and use it as a benchmark at every level of our institution? So, and that really sets me taking to the reason for the title, Taking Care of Heart, Mind, and Body, Sustaining and Nurturing a Catholic Benedictine Environment. Just want to say just a few words, so just to give you a roadmap. What I want to do is I want to look at simply what does it mean to have this culture of mind, of the kind of intellectual exploration that we do, okay? Our hearts, where our faith is, our affective life, community, all of that set of questions. And then our bodies, the physical world that we live in, okay? So that's really the three-part division that I'm using, and it's flowing. I did not want to fly up in the stratosphere at 35,000 feet, even though I need to know, to lay out some kind of conceptual framework here, okay? And some of the basis for what I'm saying. So I wanted to weave some practical examples in. So I'm going to be moving up and down, okay? And not being exhaustive, but simply pointing to some examples. I also did not want to go and somehow skew off into areas that, in fact, I know that others are going to be addressing later on. So I'm trying to do what I was asked to do, I guess. As monastic communities, and I want to point to what Archabbot Douglas said here, as monastic communities, we pray the Psalms every day. So the idea of sustainability is woven into the fabric of the Psalter. Again and again, the psalmist says in one way or another, from one generation to the next, we will praise your name, O God. Or she asks for God's blessing, such that she will be still full of sap, still green into old age. or there's a plea for help that he may tell the next generation about God's kindness and goodness. Or there's a gentle kind of threat. If you let me go down into the dust, who will give you praise? In other words, God, if I'm not here, you're going to miss me. An often unspoken task of our lives as monks is handing on a monastic life and a culture to future generations in terms of all of the elements of the monastic culture that in fact make it something that wants to move into the future. Our monastic places, we want a vibrant, praying, and working monastic community in relationship to all of our schools, even though that relationship has to change. And it will move up and down, and the governance will change, and everything else will change. But we want that kind of living, dynamic relationship. So as we work on sustainability in our schools and monasteries, let me begin with sustaining and nurturing the mind. We are mission-driven institutions, Catholic, Benedictine, and, okay? Some of you are in an urban environment and you focus less on being residential. Others have a variety of graduate programs. And so our respective mission statements should differ from each other. We've just been working on our own at St. John's, and we apply the kind of test. If we go and take and plug St. Olaf or McAllister or St. Cloud State into our mission statement, and it doesn't seem to matter, we got a problem. That is there's not enough specificity. We haven't done it. Likewise, the vision statement needs to be specific enough that it helps faculty, students, administration focus their energies. I think I can say hands down, every single one of us, no matter whether we're a staff, in administration, whether we're faculty, we want a lively intellectual life on our campuses. We are learning communities. It describes what we do. And as Catholic colleges, we want to make sure that the historic Catholic commitment to the ongoing conversation between faith and reason is truly lively, and that it really defends against those who are totally skeptical and those who are totally rationalist. We wish to integrate this search for truth with simply an automatic, routine, ongoing dialogue with the ethical questions that are simply around us every day in all that we do. As Benedictine places, we have a particular concern for the place of worship as communities of prayer in the lives of students, and the relationship of this worship to lives of service. Being both Catholic and Benedictine allows us, as Archabbot Douglas pointed out, allows us to be strongly and unapologetically Catholic, because the Benedictine value of hospitality, and not just value, practice of hospitality, opens us towards students and faculty who differ in their beliefs. Hospitality allows us to, in fact, be in conversation with folks who have very different beliefs. Probably the only time we run into trouble is when somebody says, you shouldn't be Catholic and you shouldn't be Benedictine. That's a conversation stopper for us. To be sure, we will never drive up to a consensus on these important issues at 60 miles an hour. But regular attention to the question, what do we mean by our distinctive Catholic and Benedictine mission, is crucial to the sustainability of these learning communities in the tradition that we have received. Why are these questions of mission identity so important for sustainability? Because when we get to the questions of budget and priorities and focus, it is ultimately the mission and all the thought around it that has to guide decision making. I'm sure you've had this. Sometimes two pathways, one towards a more sustainable future and the other one that's just business as usual. The economic consequences are really close and hard to do, huh? And you can't tell the difference, or maybe even the one that's sustainable is a little more expensive. Where are you going to go? If the bottom line is always the driver, then in fact we will never ever turn the corner and move toward a more sustainable environment. Sometimes the economics as well as the seeming ecological consequences of one pathway versus the other are incredibly close. Bill McKibben in God and the Environmental Crisis writes, open quote, our religious communities, and here he's not talking about monastic communities, but our religious communities in a kind of a totally inclusive sense here, are deeply important because they are almost the only institutions left in our society that posit some goal other than accumulation for our existence here on this planet. Beyond this, it is worthwhile to have faculty and students who are regularly working on the daily questions of environmental stewardship and sustainability on the campus. All of us are striving to keep this set of questions as a leaven in our conversations, whether in physical plant, in student residence halls, computing centers, classrooms, economics, the questions of political science. I mean, if we're going to move towards a sustainable culture, we've got to have a democracy that works. So political science becomes extremely important. That is, how do we make decisions as communities and society that in fact pull us together rather than just continue to fragment and polarize us? Students, of course, are transient. They really do need and want to graduate, okay? And each year brings with it a whole new set of learners, a whole new set of people that we have to, if you will, form into the culture of St. Vincent or Benedictine University or St. Anselm's or St. John's and St. Ben's, etc., okay? We're constantly facing this huge formation challenge in terms of what we really want to think about on our campuses and the way we want to practice. And finally, another question worth asking has to do, what are we teaching? It's worthwhile to pull out the course catalog and simply do a scan in terms of what are the courses that in fact address centrally and more importantly all of the fundamental issues about being Catholic and Benedictine. However, when I was doing organic chemistry, working in the lab, I always talk to students about their care in terms of what we're sewering in that lab, in terms of what do we want to go into the wastewater stream. So there's a place for thinking about the ethics of what we're doing and what we're trying to be and do at almost every level of our teaching and learning, okay? So secondly, sustaining and nurturing the heart. I think I'm doing okay in terms of time, okay? Sustaining and nurturing the heart. Men and women who work in our colleges as faculty, staff, administrators, as well as support staff, come to us out of a sense of vocation, a call. Obviously, I'm using the word vocation here in a big, big sense, okay? Their being with us is surely not about the money. Simply because if you want to make a lot of money being a college prof or working in a college environment, that's not the way to do it. You look somewhere else, okay? We can leaven a powerful conversation among faculty and staff by drawing on this motivation, and that is the motivation of vocation, of the deepest desires that faculty and staff, in terms of loving learning, loving their field, being passionate about wanting to teach in this kind of an environment. Believe me, there is an energy there. And even if someone has been doing this for 20 years and it's getting just a little bit old, below the surface, that call is there waiting to be revived. We will encounter in this sense of vocation the passion that is in the hearts of our coworkers, the place where wonder, awe, love, and the desire to know and understand are located. We need to make sure that our faculty and staff realize that our entire campus is working together to help our students discover their vocation in life, to get a better read on where each student's true gifts are, not only intellectually, but also personally. The union of thinking, feeling, and believing. And in this role, the faculty member, the librarian who gets a student going on a research project, the person who guides the recycling program, all of these, every single individual has a role in the transformation of our students into people who care about sustainability. As learning environments in a loud, fast-moving, high-tech world, we encourage the development of contemplative skills as well. The contemplative skills of studying and reading. All of our students should know, at least intuitively, what Lectio Divina is, what it means to attend to a text in a contemplative manner, whether from Scripture, Shakespeare, poetry, Mary Oliver, Wendell Berry, you name it. What it means to sit with a text and let it soak into us, into them. When I'm doing Lectio or centering prayer, I'm doing something that is in fact deeply restorative. And it is helping me sustain myself as a thinking, feeling, believing human person. And while I'm doing it, I'm not shopping. Okay. We need to model the value and meaning of human relationships and the way that they anchor and sustain us each day. And I couldn't help but, as I was watching the video last night, the DVD with you, in terms of, constantly in our Benedictine environments, that core value and practice of community is so crucial. To use that awareness and helping our students to understand that as simply a fundamental way of being human in the world, and how deeply sustaining human relationships are as we go forward, okay? It's precisely going in the opposite direction of the man who built the hut and ultimately drove everybody away from himself. It is in community that we, in fact, will draw on the gifts and the experience, the wisdom, all the gifts of the Spirit that, in fact, make it possible for us to actually make decisions and move forward toward a sustainable culture and campus. Sustaining and nurturing the body. As Catholic and Benedictine institutions, we live out of a powerful, pervasive, sacramental sense of the physical world. That is, we take Genesis 1 seriously, that the creation is good. Indeed, it is very good. In sharp contrast to those Gnostics in the early centuries for whom the material was in the way of the divine, something to be shucked off on the way toward holiness, we view the material world as a pathway to the divine. St. Benedict surely shared this sense as well when he urges the cellarer and all the monks to treat the tools of the monastery as if they were the vessels of the altar, in that most fortuitous phrase, the vessels of the altar. Benedict also notes that we believe that the divine presence is everywhere. So, we as monks, we can gather in church, but if they can't get back, where do they pray? out in the field. Because God is there too. Okay? In addition, in the rule, there are many other references to taking care, to being good stewards, whether it's of clothing, of spaces, and other necessities. Through his comments on making sure that the cellarer, a guest master, and other key personnel are not overwhelmed by the work, that they should receive assistance so that their lives are sane, Benedict is trying to make sure that these jobs are sustainable within the monastic culture. We should need to be aware of that in terms of the work we do on a day-to-day basis in our colleges. So, changing the way we think about energy. In the United States and other industrialized countries, we've been traveling down a road that I believe is coming to an end. Our energy system depends on cheap and available fossil fuels. And up to this time, this system has been transported to other less industrialized countries. And now we're at a point where it is no longer, if you will, to scale up these processes. And this point becomes clear when we do a thought experiment with India or China. China with 1.4 billion people. India with, I want to say, 1.1 billion people. In China, per person consumption rates are about 1/6 of those in the U.S. If their consumption rate were to match ours, world energy production per year would have to double. Even those who are most optimistic about world petroleum supplies do not think that this is prudent. If we were able to produce all of this carbon-based energy, the resulting increase in world CO2 production would be catastrophic for us and the planet in terms of global warming. The cheapest energy that we can ever buy on our campuses and our monasteries, and that will reduce our carbon footprint, is the energy that we don't use. Sustainability requires us to review how we use electrical power on campus and how we can reduce that consumption. Here I'm really drilling down into the concrete here, okay? I'm going to back out of this again, but for the sake of concreteness here, how much electricity do we use? And be really clear about, with everybody, in terms of building a consensus about turning off computers, lights in classrooms, printers, other trickle devices, trickle charges, you name it. Are there other ways to generate electricity, such as solar panels or biodiesel fuel? In my environment at St. Ben's and St. John's, okay, we're because we have the two campuses. The question that I have is, how do we reduce the number of cars on campus? And we have a very good bus system that moves back and forth. How do we just convince all of our students that that's the preferred way to move back and forth, as well as our faculty? Okay, they're good buses. They work well. Okay, but it's building that consensus. Question we I think need to ask you on this campus, St. Vincent, are obviously making an attention simply to make every new building LEED certified. That is to really make them efficient. We may need to ask the question down the line is, should we build the building? Should we build it? Period. Even if we have the money, is there another way to do it? In terms of the overall carbon footprint. I realize that's a hard question, especially since new things are coming along, we have new dreams, etc. But in terms of the overall sustainability and the size of the carbon footprint of our campuses, we have to think about that set of questions. Metering and conservation. I'm sure that on many of our campuses, one of the major barriers to conserving electricity and water is a lack of metering. We are just installing metering. And forgive me for using our own campus as an example, because I'm not trying, it's what I know well, and I'm not trying to set it up as some kind of example, either negative or positive. But, we realized a few years ago that there was simply no incentive for conservation. Until we really know what's going on with our use of electricity and lights in the Abbey Church, for example, how do we ever reduce it? How do we cut it in half? What practices would reduce it? So getting a handle on that is extremely important. Debt load. I hesitate to bring up the topic of debt load. We are in an extremely competitive environment, and we sometimes feel forced to add extra amenities to the campus in order to attract and retain students. I tend to think that we don't hesitate to borrow money to build housing because they generate their own revenue stream. Okay? But for other kinds of construction, we may find ourselves mortgaging the future rather than waiting and raising the money first. The payments have to come from somewhere, and they can be a driver towards higher tuition rates. I think that there are lots of folks in higher education who are asking questions about the sustainability of our current fiscal models for higher education. How do we, as Benedictine and Catholic institutions, move both toward greater simplicity and greater engagement on the part of students and everybody else? How do we get to the balance of moderation in terms of simply the scale of our physical plant and excellence in terms of learning? Auditing and solid waste. How much solid waste is hauled off our campuses each day? Where have we gradually incorporated disposable materials into our work and lives without much thought as to where all this stuff ultimately has to go? One of the first things our Abbey task force did was, I set up a task force about 1.5 years ago on sustainability, and just for the monastery, I just said, stay local, guys, okay? We can't fix the world. Let's work on ourselves. And one of the first things they did was audit the weekly garbage. Not a pretty thing to do, okay? But it has led us to move towards a policy. We somehow incorporated the use of plastic and paper cups into our little kitchenette in the monastery dining room. 24,000 of those critters a year. 1,000 a month of each. 24,000 of them. We just finally said, this has got to stop. Okay? Now, there is going to be whimpering as we put that decision into being. But in fact, there's no question in my mind that it is the right decision to make. Similarly, we returned to a practice we always had of using cloth napkins in our refectory. Now, we have a lot more consensus and control within a smaller monastic environment, but even for us, these are not easy decisions. Within a college environment, it's much more difficult. This past spring, the Student Senate dealt with, finally, the issue of all these cotton-picking plastic bottles for water on campus, and made the decision, and it really had to be ground up. It could not be something that was imposed from the top. It had to be our students wrestling with the issue of, what are we doing? And this is what we're going to do. And so they made the decision to eliminate plastic water bottles in terms of selling them on our campus. So, but again, I forgive me if I'm getting too specific, but at the same time, this is where the rubber hits the road on some of these things, okay? Sustainability in the dining room. Here I am in deep trouble, okay? If you've watched any TV program in the evening, no doubt you've noticed that about 1/3 of the ads are for foods that pack walloping loads of calories, 1/3 are for weight loss gimmicks and exercise equipment, and the other third are for a set of age-related dilemmas that men and women face. In a fine book entitled In Defense of Food, Michael Pollan summarizes his thinking about nutrition with 3 short phrases. Eat food, not too much, and mostly plants. Okay? Eat food. A comedian noted that he was going along a counter in a supermarket and he came across a package labeled cheese food. Anytime we have to be reassured that something is food. Probably isn't. Pollan's comment, your grandmother should recognize it as such. Your grandmother. Pre all of the processing. Huh? Not too much. Eating slowly and having a good sense of portion control is essential to healthy eating. And I think this is part of the culture we want to, without being too intrusive, to work with students and everybody in terms of simply what are good ways to be in the world. Now, having said all this, I realize that our food services are faced an incredible challenge because they are feeding a large number of human beings each day with a minimum number of staff and receiving materials that are highly processed for the most part. Because all of the labor, in terms of preparing fresh stuff, it could get to be very costly. Clearly, this is an area where it's not going to be a matter of all or nothing, but it's going to be a matter of making headways where you can. And maybe some of you can speak to the issue of what you've done in terms of this current situation. Finally, physical fitness and sustainability. We continue to discover the importance of rigorous physical exercise for maintaining physical health, its importance for enhancing learning and memory, for rebalancing hormones, and for channeling destructive tension and other metabolites from the body. And those benefits, of course, come to us from a balance of both cardio and strength training. I mean, we're learning too that, you can do a lot of cardio training, okay, but it's simply you're never going to replenish the muscle in our bodies, given the fact that we're not pitching bales each day, okay? We're just not the kind of agrarian people or working hard with our bodies so that we maintain a good sense of physical strength. But we also need to maintain a sense of flexibility, balance, all those things that over the long haul, again, and this is personal sustainability, okay? But our students really need to be aware of that. I suspect that each one of our campuses has invested in one of these really seriously high-tech, wonderful, beautiful fitness centers, okay? I would urge caution in that area. First of all, those machines cost a lot of money. Secondly, they wear out really fast and demand a lot of maintenance. And thirdly, balancing it off with some simple free weights, exercise balls, and getting some good trainers to work with students. Because ultimately, weights are pretty indestructible, okay, compared to machines run by electricity and all the other stuff. I think that aiming and working towards a simplicity in this kind of technology is just extremely important. I'm going to simply close out by saying and citing the ecologist John Carroll from the University of New Hampshire. He wrote a book called Sustainability and Spirituality. And he notes that there are perceived differences between monastic communities with an educational apostolate and those without. Each suspects that the other has it easier and better. The monastic higher education environment has more people, more labor, more help, and a wider range of opportunities than does the other more simple monastic environment. However, he writes, I have found the monastic higher education environment busier, more wrapped up in its ongoing work, potentially somewhat less creative, and generally more conservative and cautious, albeit with more opportunity for good work toward sustainability. This characteristic somewhat parallels the cautious, conservative nature of almost all institutions of higher learning, private or public, religiously affiliated or not. They are essentially conservatives of the culture, even when the culture is wrong, is bad, or is no longer congruent with reality. And believe me, the culture is going that way towards, just as it always has for the last 50 years, a consumption culture. And sustainability is going that way. So we really are faced with a challenge of moving very determinedly against the grain. So that's the challenge for us. To really understand environmental sustainability requires a fundamental conversion of thought, of the ordering of our values and desires, of our understanding and practice. Surely, a true change in our system of values could only occur as a conversion experience, for it would necessitate a fundamental change from deep within us, not simply to alter how we do things, but to change the value presupposition of why we do things is a conversion of the deepest kind. Thank you for your kind attention.